Hi everyone, I'm Zach Reinhardt, here to talk about my top 20 albums of 2017. This video is just going to be the first half of this list. I split them up because these videos get super long every time. This is going to be number 20 through 11, and there will be a video uploaded shortly after this one. It might already be up if you're watching this. That is going to be 10 through 1. And I don't have anything to pad the runtime anymore. We're going to get right into it with number 20 on my list is the new Boris album, Dear. Boris is one of my favorite bands of all time. Their discography is this huge, unwieldy monstrosity that is hard to sort through. And while I enjoyed this album, I just found it to be really kind of redundant for Boris. I didn't feel at any point that Boris was really doing anything that they haven't already done better somewhere. And while I gave it a very kind of middling review at the time, and I stand by that, I do think this album has grown on me a little bit more since then, and enough to make it onto the list at least. This album is just Boris doing what Boris always does, and while it feels like they're just kind of going through the motions a little bit, it doesn't feel like they're phoning it in. The production on this thing is really good. The heavier moments on here are really visceral, really kinetic, and they have a lot of just mass to them. And while I'm not a huge fan of some of the lighter stuff that reminds me a little bit of their more kind of poppier, shoegazier phase, there are some good songs on here, and there's some good just heavy, doomy metal on here. And while it's not anything groundbreaking for Boris, and they've certainly reached higher peaks than this, I do think that this is a solid enough listen, and it has grown on me a little bit since I reviewed it initially. Then, moving on to number 19, we have the strange menagerie of sounds that is Kamichio by Whoophead Clerms. I reviewed this album earlier in the year, and it's just this big mess of strange samples and jittery electronics, and doesn't really have any sort of cohesive songness to it. And I wasn't really sure what to think of it when I first reviewed it, and I'm still kind of not sure what to think of it. It's so far divorced from like what I normally review and what we kind of think of normal music being, that it's kind of hard to really view it critically. But it is an album that I kept returning to throughout the year and just giving a listen, and I'm still not sure if it's good, but it certainly left a mark on me, and I just couldn't quite put it down throughout the year. And here it is, number 19. And next up for number 18, we have Never Young Beach with A Good Time. Never Young Beach is a kind of tropical sounding indie pop band from Tokyo, and this is, I think, their third album. Yeah, their third album. And it's just a really solidly produced, well performed, and overall well written collection of indie pop songs. Nothing on here is particularly mind-blowing or new for the indie pop genre, or even new for Never Young Beach, but their kind of puzzle-like way that they write their three guitars make for some really interesting grooves on here, and there's just some really solid, slick, catchy pop songs on here. And at number 17, my most recent review makes an appearance. It's North of Hell by Butcher ABC. This is the first album from like incredibly long-standing gore grind and death metal band Butcher ABC. And while the band does sound a bit stuck in their ways, and this is in a lot of ways just kind of a traditional 90s death metal record, it's just got really great production. The whole thing's really punchy and visceral. Everything sounds really good. And while some of the songwriting, especially in the middle of the album, is kind of meh, the peaks on this album are really good. Especially that closer. It just hits me like a truck every time that first fucking distorted metal ass chord comes in. But yeah, it's a bit maybe out of its time songwriting wise, but production wise it's very modern, and it's just a pretty solid metal album. Then at number 16 we have the self-titled debut full-length album from Satellite Young. This thing is a pretty faithful kind of 80s J-pop throwback with some more modern synthwave elements mixed in, and just some really catchy direct songwriting. There's really not a bad track on here. The whole album is kind of bouncy and fun, and while the production is a little bit brittle for me, and I think they could use some work in that aspect, overall this was just one of the best kind of pure pop albums of the year. And clocking in at number 15, we have Chip Tanaka with Django. Chip Tanaka is the alias of Mr. Hirokazu Tanaka, who was, back in the 80s, a video game composer. He composed music for video games, including the original Metroid, Kid Icarus, and, of course, the Mother or Earthbound series. And this year he made his first foray into making a solo studio album, and I think it came out really great. This thing is eclectic and a bit weird. It's not afraid to be a bit experimental, but it's also surprisingly direct and accessible, and there's some real earworm melodies on here, even when it's doing some kind of strange jazzy experimentation or something like that. And of course we get plenty of video gamey chiptune locked in here as well. These are all songs that he had written for like live performances over the past like decade, and that amount of time really shows, because these songs feel really honed and well crafted, and it came out for a really great album. Then at number 14 we have the new album from Lucky Old Sun, Belle Epoque. Lucky Old Sun is a little indie pop band that on this record puts across this kind of indie pop with a lot of respect and influence from like old folk, and a kind of cute, kitschy, hipstery aesthetic that I find kind of charming. There's a lot of killer and very little filler on this thing. I find the whole album to be pretty compelling. And what really strikes me as kind of incredible about this record is how well it balances this kind of lively rawness of like a human performing on an instrument and the kind of clean poppy aesthetic that it has in the production. And I think it balances those two really well. The performances are all really direct. They feel personal. You know, this album feels kind of intimate, but it's also really well produced. Everything's really clean and clear and punchy, and I think that's the kind of ideal mix for a guitar-based indie pop record like this. Overall, just some really fun, kind of charming indie pop. And at 13, we have the new Tempele record, From Japan 2. As you might guess, this is their second record. And Tempele is just putting together some really solid, well-crafted, kind of poppy, accessible psych rock that I find to be pretty up my alley and pretty enjoyable. There's some really great grooves on this. The production is really nice. It's very clear and punchy, but it has this kind of fuzziness to it that adds to this kind of psych rock vibe that they go for. And the guitar tones are really great all over this thing. There's some really great just psychedelic rock jams on here. And there's also a lot of catchy choruses and poppy moments as well. This is a very accessible, easy to listen to kind of psych pop, psych rock record that still experiments with texture and songwriting a little bit. And I think it all comes together for a really solid record. And at number 12, we have Loop Rider's new record, Umi. This is the third record from Tokyo-based heavy rock and metal band Loop Rider. And on this record, they put together a 25-minute monstrosity that is, I guess, playing with post-rock, but doesn't completely abandon their kind of roots in like shoegaze and like kind of doomy metal stuff. That's those influences still show up, but it's mostly a post-rock song. And I gotta say, this is the most interesting thing I've heard somebody do with post-rock in years. The genre has been really kind of dead to me for a while. And so it's really great to hear some kind of new, fresher takes on it. And this thing is, I mean, what can I say about a big 25-minute post-rock song? It's at times serene and beautiful. It is at times heavy and loud. It really spans a wide range of sounds while remaining a pretty cohesive project, and just has a really nice build and fall to it, and is just a really pretty, nice record that I've listened to a bunch of times this year whenever I can set aside 25 minutes to dedicate to listen to one song. And at number 11, topping the first half of the list, we have Pungyeon, I guess that's how you pronounce it, by Ningu. Ningu is this kind of strange instrumental rock band that combines elements of like math rock and progressive rock with like a little bit of punk, a little bit of like chiptune-y electronics that appear, and they really have a sound kind of carved out all for themselves. And this is their second record, and it's just really solid. The production is heavy and punchy, and the guitar playing is really kind of in your face. The drums sound great on this record, and the winding, strange songs that Ningu writes are always just compelling and interesting to listen to. And they managed to wrap up all these really interesting ideas into pretty short, kind of 4 or 5 or maybe 6 minute packages, rather than doing any sort of big, long, ridiculous opuses. And I think that it all comes together really well on this new record. The production is a bit raw, if you're not into that. They're not like a band like Jocho or something that have really clean, clear production. This is definitely a bit more lo-fi, but I found it to be really compelling. And I mean, you just gotta love a kind of wacky, out there rock record when it comes around. And that's it for the first half of the list here. I will put a card somewhere around here for you to click on. That will take you over to the next part, number 10 through number 1. And of course, there's always a link in the description as well that will be linked to the next video. So, yeah, I'll see you guys over there in just a moment. All right, peace.